Good morning, folks. For those who are trickling in, we're just getting the tech figured out and waiting on a few more attendees, and we will get started shortly.
Davide is going to also send out a quick email to everybody who signed up with the actual webinar link in case people are just clicking out if they think that Davide's name is coming up or something and there's an error. We had, I think, about 85, 90 people physically signed up for the entire conference, but all but about 10 of them specified they were coming. So I don't know if we'll actually get 80, but hopefully we get a more than 6 for sure, I expect.
It is also 9 a.m. on a Friday morning. So we should acknowledge that.
I'm making a couple last minute posts on socials too.
Yeah, we're.
Thanks, Kenya.
Yes, this is the link that
Davide says that the link that you just sent Tabitha was the one that he sent out. Well, but clearly not, because everyone's joining as you. Yeah.
So in the interest of time, I think we're going to have to get started at 9:10 regardless. Hopefully those who are having difficulty finding the link will be able to find their way in. And in the meantime, those who have attended, please note that you can change your name to the appropriate name. If you came in via a link that came from Davide, you may end up being listed as an attendee under his name, please go ahead and change your name appropriately. But welcome to everyone who has found their way here this morning.
Yeah, sorry about this. We're now he's just sending out the link, but yesterday went too smoothly, I guess. I don't know. It was bound to happen.
Alex, did you want to let in the attendees that are currently there just so that they know what's going on as well? If it's
They are currently live.
Oh, okay, my apologies.
Yeah, we have 8 attendees in, and we are live and are recording for everyone who's.
Just a reminder, everybody, if you could please change your attendee name. There was an issue with the link, so you're just gonna, I believe, click on yourself and just type in your real name. That would be much appreciated.
And it is 9:10, and we do have a full day of conferencing ahead of us. It's always good to get things started on time so that things can end on time later in the day, and we don't cut into the lunch break too much. So let's go ahead and get started, and more people will be trickling in, I'm sure. So good morning. My name is Justin Paulson. I'm the director of the Institute of Political Economy here at Carleton. And the organizing committee gave me the honor and pleasure of welcoming you and introducing the keynote speaker for this conference. First, I want to acknowledge that although you all may be joining us from places far and wide, the Institute of Political Economy is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Omama Winniniwak, the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. And I make this acknowledgement to remind all of us here that the Algonquin people remain the guardians and caretakers of this land, that those of us who are settlers are their guests, and hence we have a duty to honor and uphold the land itself and the sovereign indigenous rights on this unceded, unsurrendered Anishinaabe territory. This is the 22nd annual Graduate Student Conference at the Institute of Political Economy, and the Institute has played a key role in promoting critical interdisciplinary scholarship at Carleton since 1989. And it remains the only standalone graduate program in political economy in Canada. Our annual student conference is entirely student organized and student run. And so before I introduce the keynote speaker, I just want to give a thanks and shout out first to the organizing committee itself. This year's committee did an outstanding job of bringing everyone together under incredibly challenging circumstances. So kudos are due to Zoe Abernethy, Ariel Betcherer, and Davide Ventrone, as well as to Kenya Thompson, and to our Institute's administrator, Tabitha Malaman. And I also want to acknowledge the generous support of 5 other departments and schools in both the Faculty of Public Affairs and the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. These are departments and schools that really help make our Institute flourish. This is Geography and Environmental Studies, Indigenous and Canadian Studies, Journalism and Communication, Sociology and Anthropology, and the School of Social Work. This is the Institute's second foray into a 2-day event over Zoom. And while we don't expect any technical issues besides the one that you have all faced already this morning, if you have any, you may contact the conference organizers at ipegradconf@gmail.com or just contact the organizers in the chat. Throughout the day, organizers may be posting Zoom etiquette tips in the chat windows during each session as appropriate. And with that, I will proceed to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Deniz DuRuiz is a sociocultural anthropologist who works with Kurdish migrant farm workers and Syrian refugees in Turkey and in Europe. For her doctoral dissertation, she completed 20 months of combined ethnographic research between 2009 and 2016 in the hometowns of the migrant workers in the Kurdish region of Western Turkey and at 12 different rural work sites, farms, greenhouses, charcoal production, public landscaping, and the like. She also worked as a volunteer coordinator of international medical NGOs at the Syrian border of Turkey during the mass exodus of Syrian refugees into Turkey in 2014 and 2015. She is the creator and host of the Keynote podcast and the co-organizer of the Colloquium on Refugees, Migrants, and Statelessness at Northwestern University. She is working on a book manuscript that examines how political violence and the racialization of Kurds and Syrians transformed the migrant labor regime in rural Turkey. Her postdoctoral research explores the Syrian experience of migration to Europe with a focus on labor. Presently, she is a visiting fellow in the Department of Anthropology at McGill University and a visiting professor here at the Institute. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. DuRuiz. If you have questions for Dr. DuRuiz, please feel free to post them in the Q&A at any time. They'll get collated at the end, and then I will raise them to Dr. DuRuiz. If you're unable to change your name appropriately, or if you came in using the wrong link and you would like to be identified in your question, please introduce yourself at the beginning of your question. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to Dr. DuRuiz. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank the organizing committee and Tabitha and Justin for making this possible and for inviting me for this keynote speech. I've been following the panel since yesterday, and it's very inspiring, and I learned a lot. And thank you all for making the time to come here and listen to me on a Friday morning at 9 a.m. Today, I will talk to you about my research on migrant farm workers from northern Kurdistan, which is the Kurdish areas in Turkey, and Syrian refugees who also became farm workers when they came to Turkey. Kurds, just like the First Nations of Canada, are a people whose land was conquered and divided among nation states. Having worked with Kurds made me understand the value of recognition and acknowledgement better. So before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm giving this talk in the virtual platforms of Carleton University, built on the unceded lands of the Algonquin Nation. Being a visiting professor at the university, at the Institute of Political Economy is very exciting, particularly because it gives me the opportunity to be in conversation with a group of young scholars whose political commitments and intellectual curiosity impresses and motivates me. You guys inspired me to take some risks, therefore. So this will be an unconventional talk in that I will present a work in progress. I will talk about an unpopular topic, namely the family. And finally, in the first half of the talk, I will not use a PowerPoint. So that will be the test of your listening skills. That last part was a joke. It's a difficult task to talk about the caring and nurturing potential of the family while still maintaining a critical distance to be able to observe its violent, exploitative, and governmental characteristics. In other words, without falling into the trap of familialism or familialism. And it is definitely not a very difficult time to do it. Indeed, the family as a social unit, an institution in the Durkheimian sense, has all these violent, exploitative, biopolitical, and governmental functions, both within and outside the West. That is why decolonial, anti-capitalist, feminist, and critical race studies scholars, social scientists, political economists, and intellectuals have mostly abandoned the family as a unit of analysis, and instead focused on specific relations of care and solidarity, as well as domination and exploitation through concepts like social reproduction, care labor, gender-based violence. It emerges out of, but my choice of the family, focusing on the family as a unit of analysis, emerges out of two reasons, one political and one methodological. The methodological one is that I am an anthropologist, and my discipline's signature research method of ethnography brought me to this issue of the family. If one takes the creed of theorizing from the ground up, and I do, I need to attend to the ways in which the concept of family exceeds the multiplicity of social, political, and economic relations that anthropologists broadly term kinship. In other words, the family as a social unit appeared in my ethnography over and over again as an emic category in the old-fashioned anthropological terminology, which of course does not mean that I should take it uncritically and use it as my analytical category. But I have to do something with it. And this talk is an attempt of dealing with that something. So the concept of family does something for the worker and refugee families that I worked with, something that overflows our critical theories and understandings, and sometimes dismissals of the category of family due to the aforementioned political concern of familialism. And what is that something, and what does it do then? My second reason of dealing with the family is political. I learned my most valuable political lessons from my interlocutors, namely Kurdish migrant workers and Syrian refugees, whose attachment and loyalty to family is deeply interconnected with their experiences of surviving war and economic hardship. This is not a positive note to start a talk on, but honestly, I'm not very hopeful about our times. The climate crisis, the unending pandemic, the persistence of authoritarian regimes, the rise of all sorts of right-wing movements, war and political violence prolonged over many decades, the newly erupting wars, and the forced displacement caused by all of these factors are the harbingers of a darker rather than a brighter future. For this reason, it is important to learn resilience from those who have endured such hardships. And as the privileged people who still have access to housing, relative freedom, and some sort of stability during the pandemic, many of us still turned to the family for physical safety, emotional support, and financial stability. We did not turn to care. We did not turn to social reproduction. We turned to family. So there is, again, something, an amalgamation of desires and affects in the concept of family that overflows and exceeds the singular relationships among individuals in the family. Some anthropologists, like Michael Lumbeck, explain it through ritual. Others explain it through earlier iterations explained it through solidarity, but there is something, I think, that exceeds those theorizations even more in the context of political violence intersecting with political economy. As a feminist and socialist anthropologist, I'm very uncomfortable, though, with pronouncing these words. The words by which I value the concept of the family. The something that I emphasize, which overflows care and solidarity. As something that the right-wing politics and both liberal and conservative governments tap into so skillfully, and we as critical scholars and intellectuals edge away from. So again, I ask, what is that something? So I took the risk of presenting a work in progress that I have been trying to theorize for a couple of years, and admittedly procrastinating on it because it makes me so uncomfortable politically and intellectually, and because it sounds so outdated as a form of anthropology. And I hope to improve it with your feedback. So please listen with an open mind and explore the potentials with me, while also keeping me from falling into the aforementioned the trap of familialism. So let's talk about that familialism first. The family as a naturalized unit of kinship appears frequently in right-wing and conservative political rhetoric, and it's often used to justify governing of peoples through a legally defined and heteronormative patriarchal nuclear unit. In some relatively liberal nation states like Canada, the law recognizes same-sex marriage, common law partnership, and there's even a shy acknowledgement that for some Indigenous people, family may mean a kinship group. For example, the online high school curriculum of Canada states, because we are so culturally diverse, there are many different meanings of family in Canada. Thank you. It goes on to explain, in conventional Canadian society, families generally refer to some formation and combination of parent and or children. Below this description, the website cites the definitions of 6 types of Canadian families: nuclear family, childless family, lone parent family, extended family, blended family, and common law family. This categorical, schematic, and amicable picture of kinship is, of course, an anthropologist's worst nightmare. Our entire discipline is founded upon decades of debates on how complicated kinship is in terms of the inclusion or exclusion of individuals, the porous and fluid nature of the categories, and the embodied and affective relations among individuals and collectives, which includes enmity and hostility as much as support, harmony, and solidarity. Additionally, the family is a legal category that stands at the heart of the nation-state system, and the practices of governmentality all around the world builds on it as a site of intervention. Since the 1970s, feminist historians and social scientists have been exploring how the emergence of the nuclear family as the ideal social unit of modernity is intimately linked to the construction of the modern nation-state and Western industrial society. This type of family disciplined men, women, and children into certain patterns of behavior, built new understandings of the self, redefined the norms and modes of relating to one another, and relegated the so-called traditional forms of kinship and regarded them as an impediment to the making of a modern nation. This ideal type of heteronormative nuclear family was never limited to the white people in the West. Indeed, the other of this family was reinvented in the colonies and among the racialized and indigenous populations, both within and outside the West. For example, the so-called matriarchal Black family, supposedly discovered by sociologists in the US in the 50s and 60s, was designed as the difference that constitutes the white normativity. Matriarchy was seen as inherent to the strength of Black women, contrasted with the sexist image of the fragile white woman, which simultaneously created another racialized figure of the absent Black father. Angela Davis, among other Black feminists, challenged this view by arguing, quote, "The source of their strength was not some mystical power attached to motherhood, but rather their concrete experiences as slaves." Similarly, post-colonial theory and transnational feminisms have explored how non-Western ideas of being modern were inextricably intertwined with Western notions of modernity, and how the post-colonial ruling elites in most of the world viewed the nuclear heteronormative and patriarchal family as the ideal site of raising modern, civilized, rational, and productive citizens to build the newly emerging post-colonial nation, which was to catch up with the West. As Ivan Illich said, It took 20 years for 2 billion people to define themselves as underdeveloped. Although the ruling elites of the post-colonial nation states also incessantly underlined the cultural and religious difference of their national identity from the West, the desire that the Western nuclear family created seemed assimilable into the culturally different but soon-to-be modern nation that they aimed to create. However, the post-colonial nation also had its internal others, and they emulated and reproduced the discourses and methods of colonization of the West on their internal others. And Kurds, as I will talk about today, are those internal others for Turkey. Thus, the forms of kinship and relatedness of the orientalized, primitive, and backward internal others of the post-colony were not only differentially subject to the violence of the modern nation state and development, but also differentially preoccupied with the desires of modernity. Yet this difference was not quantitative, but qualitative. At the most intimate level, this takes us back to the family. The normative notions of the family and the so-called family values, therefore, not only creates acceptable and unacceptable forms of femininity and masculinity, and ostracizes LGBTQ plus people, single women, and even single heterosexual men of marriageable age, which slightly varies by cultural and societal norms, race, and class. But this emphasis on family also excludes all sorts of families whose kinship practices are considered non-normatively gendered, sexualized, and racialized. For example, most racialized and immigrant families are blamed for having too many children, being unable to care for, educate, and raise those children as productive citizens, and for being the cause of child labor, juvenile delinquency, and crime. Similarly, violence against women has been codified as a racialized problem within the West through the Black wife beater stereotypes, and outside the West, violence against women has been portrayed as an exclusively brown and more recently a Muslim problem, criticized by feminists, crystallizing in Spivak's famous phrase, "white men saving brown women from brown men," and in Laila Bulugut's provocative question, "Do Muslim women need saving?" Thus, the vast majority of the world also does not fit in with the ideal type of the nuclear, patriarchal, and heteronormative family. It is, nonetheless, the hegemonic form. Now that we have talked about the colonial, modernist, and capitalist roots, as well as the class, gendered, and racialized character of familialism, let me now turn to my fieldwork and empirically substantiate why I still see the family as worthy of our attention. I have been conducting research on agricultural labor in Turkey since 2008. At that time, this labor force was composed of predominantly migrant Kurdish worker families. However, this was not always the case. The composition of the agricultural labor force in Turkey changed at two pivotal points. Once during the peak of the war between the Turkish state and the Kurdish guerrillas in Kurdistan, in the 1990s, and more recently in response to the outbreak of the Syrian war in 2011 and the mass exodus of the Syrian refugees into Turkey and their subsequent employment as farm workers. Prior literature explains the proletarianization of both groups as a direct cause of dispossession, war, and displacement. I argue that war and political violence, there's a confusion in the slides here, transforms, on the one hand, the existing patterns of racialization, and on the other, the existing practices of labor and migration, and thus creates a new racialized migrant labor regime. In the context of Turkey, I identify three main racialized and militarized mechanisms of labor control and labor discipline that enabled this transformation. One of these mechanisms is what I'm trying to theorize as family wage labor, or another alternative that I'm considering as a phrase to coin is the subsumption of family under wage labor. But before I get into the nitty-gritty of it, let me begin by talking about Kurds in general. Kurds are one of the largest stateless nations. After the First World War, Kurdish lands were divided among 4 newly establishing nation states: Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. Here's a rough estimate of the numbers of Kurdish people distributed across 4 nation states, which is only an estimate because it constantly changes due to the ongoing wars in Syria, Iraq, and Turkey. When I say Kurdistan in this talk, I will be referring to northern Kurdistan, or Bakur in Kurdish, the area marked in yellow on this map. Kurdistan is tortured with centuries-long violence and occupation to such a degree that it's very hard to represent life in the region without first talking about conflict. Throughout the history of the Republic, Kurds have organized numerous revolts against these policies and the violent and oppressive governments. At other times, they chose to remain quiet or formed strategic alliances with Turkish governments, but they have always been active in determining the fate of their lands. The PKK, Kurdistan Workers' Party, has defined itself as the 29th of these Kurdish revolts against the Turkish state. It is a guerrilla organization, and it has been at war with the Turkish state since 1984. The PKK started out as a Marxist-Leninist, anti-colonial national liberation struggle against Turkey's invasion of Kurdistan, and changed its political project from national liberation to democratic autonomy in the 2000s, which we heard about yesterday in Michael Clevenger's presentation. The PKK has a mass popular support base in Kurdistan, and it is listed as a terrorist organization by Turkey and by extension of its lobbying efforts in Europe, Canada, and the United States. Here are some basic facts that can help us understand the labor practice that I followed, called the migrant farm workers from the Kurdish region, or Kurdistan, whichever way you call it. These people their homes are located in Kurdistan. But they go to Western Turkey to work for periods ranging from 40 days to 9 months, depending on the needs of the family. They travel in minivans with all their belongings for periods ranging 16 to 20 hours, and stay in minivans, trains, or buses, and stay in tents as a family. They get a small cash advance at the beginning, but the rest of the entire family's wages are paid at the end of the season to the head of the family. And their labor and migration processes are organized by mostly Kurdish men called labor intermediaries, which is a semi-formal institution that evolved during the transformation of the rural labor force of Turkey from Turkish to Kurdish workers. I began this research by conducting interviews with Turkish farmers in 2008, and a 6-week ethnographic research with Turkish, Roma, Arab, and Kurdish worker families in 2009, with additional follow-up research in the summers of 2012 and 2013 in the marked locations on the map. My initial contacts were the members of a small leftist farmers organization who introduced me to other farmers and supervisors at large agricultural corporations. Since I'm ethnically Turkish and my maternal grandfather is an agricultural technician from a rural Western provincial town, Turkish farmers did not object to my presence on their farms. Many welcomed me as a naive student doing her homework and allowed me to work alongside their workers. At the time, I had learned some work in Kurdish. My willingness to speak Kurdish with Kurdish farm workers and to help them, although rather clumsily, in the field, share meals, converse with them for several weeks, earned me enough trust to the point where they would share their stories with me. During this research, it became clear to me that farm labor was differentiated along ethno-racial lines. While Turkish workers were far fewer in number, had access to better working and living conditions, were paid higher wages and remunerated individually and on time, non-Turkish workers, who are Roma, Arab, and Kurdish workers, formed the majority of this labor force and worked as entire families, including the children and the elderly, were accommodated in tents and tractor garages, paid significantly lower wages, remunerated at the end of the season collectively, and were subject to multiple surveillance practices by their employers and by the Turkish state. Among non-Turkish workers, Kurds, the largest group of workers, had it the worst. They were treated as an ethno-racially inferior group and criminalized as, quote, potential terrorists, unquote. Labor intermediaries stood at the heart of this racialized and securitized labor practice. Their relationship with workers as kin, neighbors, acquaintances, as well as their place-based affinities and ethnic identities were deeply rooted in Kurdistan. Thus, I realized I would not be able to understand the intertwinement of racialization and capitalist production without understanding these relationships. What I refer to as Kurdistan, as I said, is the area in yellow, and within it, the area in orange marks the provinces where these workers come from. They're the lowlands of Kurdistan, whereas the northern parts are more mountainous. For the longest segment of my fieldwork, therefore, I settled in a Kurdish town called Derik in the province of Mardin in November 2014, where almost half of the population were migrant farm workers. I spent 7 months with workers, Kurdish workers and labor intermediaries in their homes, joined the daily social and political life of the town, and improved my command of the particular dialect of Derik Kurdish. In the spring of 2015, I traveled to Western Turkey to work as a farm worker myself, lodging in tents on the farms and close to the rural work sites, such as charcoal making sites and greenhouses, in 7 provinces in Western Turkey. This is me with a family of 6 workers, and 6.5 with me. While working with Kurdish farm workers, I also met with several groups of Arab workers from Kurdistan and Syrian refugees, both Kurds and Arabs, who had started working as migrant farm workers. After the harvest season, I returned home with the workers to the provinces of Diyarbakir, Mardin, Urfa, and Antalya, and visited Arab, Kurdish, and Syrian workers I met while working on the farms the previous summer. Additionally, I did some volunteer work with Syrian refugees in the provinces of Urfa and Izmir. This research was conducted during a time of high political and military tension. As the 2-year ceasefire and peace negotiations between the Turkish state and the PKK between 2013 and 2015 collapsed, inaugurating a period of warfare referred to as the urban wars, I witnessed both the most hopeful moments of the peace process, as well as its unraveling into one of the bloodiest periods of armed conflict. My fieldwork town was also hard hit, and I was trapped in the town during the urban clashes between the PKK and the Turkish army. This stark transition showed me that political violence between Turks and Kurds does not disappear in the absence of violent battles between the PKK and the Turkish state. On Turkish farms, the immense, if not impossible, task of preventing, buffering, and managing this violence falls upon the worker families, which they delegate to a labor intermediary as long as it's possible, using the labor intermediary as a buffer and avoiding direct interactions with Turks. But of course, these attempts fail most of the time because they have to work with both Turkish farmers who are their employers closely, and they are in small villages and therefore run into Turkish locals. So let me now get into how family labor is a racialized and securitized mechanism of labor control and labor discipline developed in the 1990s. Prior to the 1990s, the majority of migrant farm workers in Western Turkey were Turkish villagers from nearby provinces who owned little or no land. There were also families of Roma workers who traveled from urban areas. Only a small fraction of migrant laborers were landless Kurdish families. Turkish migrant farm workers, as many other farm workers around the world, were also paid at the end of the work. Child labor was considered normal, although the youngest children employed were aged 13 or 14. And this type of labor also depended upon the double exploitation of women's labor, both in the fields and back at home. And in case where children worked with their families, labor discipline was maintained through family relations. But family labor was not the norm. In the 1990s, war and military occupation ravaged Kurdistan to such a degree that it became impossible for the people of Kurdistan to make a living by depending solely on the economic resources of the region. This war enacted a demographic shift in the agricultural labor force of Turkey, from majority Turkish to majority Kurdish migrant workers. When I say migrant worker families, we are talking about a population of 1 million to 1.5 million migrating families each year. Additionally, this time around, it was not only the poor Kurdish villagers, but also the inhabitants of towns and cities who had never worked in agriculture, who became migrant farm workers in Western Turkey. After the 1990s, as Kurds displaced and dispossessed by the war came to form the majority of the labor force, employing an entire family and giving each worker in the family a Kurdish wage, which ranged between half and 3/4 of a Turkish worker's wage, became the norm. This is a practice I call family wage labor. Family labor is not exclusive to workers from Kurdistan. It is a typical mode of exploiting women and children's labor, as well as the collective labor of the family in agriculture, especially in non-wage labor forms such as contract labor and sharecropping on plantations and family farms. Family labor is less common in wage labor. However, its components such as finding work through kinship networks, pooling household income, and relying on productive and reproductive labor of women to monetize children's labor is also common for agriculture. A sociologist working on good agricultural practices on Turkish farms, Yıldız Atasoy, argues that Kurdish migrant workers, for Kurdish migrant farm workers, we should see the worker household rather than the individual as the main labor unit, because the individual workers accept low wages since they see themselves as a part of the household rather than an individual, and their wage contributes to the household budget. Similarly, she states, the Turkish employers believe that the workers can survive on these low wages because they see the workers as part of that household unit and calculate the Kurdish household's budget while deciding on the individual worker wages. While from a strictly economic perspective, family labor might look like labor pooling, a survival strategy of the poor, it is also important to see that migrant family labor did not emerge as the hegemonic labor form in Turkish agriculture until the massive dispossession of entire Kurdistan in 1990s. including the turning of peasants and town dwellers, PKK supporters and non-supporters alike, into migrant farm workers. As more and more Kurdish people came to form the majority of this labor force, for wages that Turkish workers would not accept, Kurdish workers going to Western Turkey for work only made economic sense if all members of the family, from children as young as 5 or 6 years old to the elderly, worked for one wage. If it were not for the employment of every member of the family, the workers say, it would not be worth traveling over 1,000 kilometers and suffering under these living and working conditions for many months. In this type of labor organization, Kurdish workers are recruited by labor intermediaries as a family based on the basis of average labor power of family members. They stay in tents or garages as a family. They are mostly assigned to the same task to complement each other's shortcomings. And although the wages are calculated per individual worker, all the wages are paid to the head of the family at the end of the season. The presence of the children and the elderly in the group of workers places the labor intermediary at a key position, both for the recruitment of family labor and for labor control. The following conversation among three farmers, Turkish farmers from a cotton producing region in Western Turkey is an example to how the intermediaries handle labor control while also making sure that employers at least partially take up the consequences of employing family labor. Sorry. Here, in the conversation, Ahmet says, I asked for 25 fellows. The labor intermediary brought 10. 8 of them were kids between the ages of 13 and 16, 2 of them old people. According to another one, Adnan says, according to the labor intermediary, it's enough if they're breathing, haha. Hamdi intervenes. This is where our problems with the workers begin. Ahmet says, we could not make them pick the cotton from the ground. The worker doesn't bend over and pick up the cotton ball that fell on the ground. She says, not my problem, it shouldn't have fallen. I called the labor intermediary. He says, be tolerant. Her temper comes from her young age. She's a child, you know. If she were a grown up, she wouldn't do so. She would bend over and pick them up from the ground. The children who have been working in the fields, since the ages 5 to 6, adopt near full physical capacity of an adult worker by the age of 12 or 13. Contrary to the presumptions of unskilled labor, farm work is not a mindless physical activity, supposing there's any unskilled labor. It requires immense stamina, patience, endurance, and self-control as certain social skills and demeanor to work in harmony with other workers. As in this conversation, Turkish farmers complain less about the physical capacity of child workers and more about their temper, which may not allow them to become obedient workers that the farmer wants. Therefore, recruiting family labor from Kurdistan structurally relies on the mediation of the labor intermediary, not only making the employer accept a combination of workers that do not fit the composition that the employer asked for, making sure that the employer does not back down from paying them the full amount agreed at the beginning of the season, but also implementing labor control, but by invoking shared social codes of proper behavior with workers, especially through age and fictive or real kinship hierarchies. This may take the form of the labor intermediary asking the employer to be tolerant, as in this case, or it may mean reprimanding the child workers or warning them to behave themselves. When deemed necessary, the older members of the family also take it upon themselves to discipline the child workers so that the employer does not do so himself. In this type of labor organization, the organizational, performative, and affective labor of intermediaries is crucial in both achieving harmony within and among the group of workers and in taking over labor control. However, the smooth integration of the labor intermediary system with family labor from Kurdistan also forecloses several questions. Why do the Kurdish children go all the way from Kurdistan with their families, stay in tents with limited access to water and electricity, and work as farm workers in Western Turkey, while their Turkish peers living in these and other parts of Western Turkey do not have to do these jobs, or at least not under the same conditions or for these low wages? And in the second time that this labor force changed, as I noted here, was when, oops, this is really far away. I came a long way, sorry. When the Syrian war began in 2011, and when more and more Syrian refugees came into Turkey and got integrated into this labor force. Once this labor regime was set up to exploit the labor power of entire families from Kurdistan, who were dispossessed and displaced due to war, racialized as potential terrorists, and organized through systems of family wage labor and subjected to racialized security and surveillance mechanisms that I didn't talk about here, involving the military police and governors, it was not too hard to integrate a similarly dispossessed and racialized group migrating with their families, namely Syrian refugees, into this labor force. Yet both the specificities of the Syrian war and the particular precarities of Syrian refugees significantly transformed this racialized migrant labor regime one more time. I can't give a detailed account of this transformation for time concerns, but I will briefly touch upon the transformation of one pattern of racialization and one aspect of the changes in the labor intermediary system. Presently, Turkey is the country that hosts the largest Syrian refugee population in the world, approximately 3,700,000 to date. However, Syrians are granted not the legal status of refugee, but an ambiguous status of foreigners under temporary protection. Similarly, their work situation is also managed with ad hoc bylaws and laws that are never implemented, as is the case for Kurds displaced and dispossessed by multiple wars and ongoing political violence. At the beginning of the Syrian war, Syrian refugees were welcomed to Turkey by both Turkish and Kurdish populations, although again with a patronizing discourse of helping hand of the Muslim Turkish older brother. As the Syrian war has completed its full decade, and it turned out that the majority of the Syrian refugees would probably neither return to Syria nor go to Europe, they were demoted from Muslim brother to, quote, dirty Arabs, as the racialized and orientalized arch enemy of the Turkish secular national imaginary, potential supporters of jihad for both secular Turks and Kurds, and the universal racial stereotype for refugees, namely benefit scroungers, although the benefits were nowhere to be found. Again, the potential criminal was defined, and the governors and military police were even more enthusiastic to implement their vision of Syrian labor exploitation, because until 2016, no regulations were issued about their employment. Studies focusing on Syrians working in seasonal agricultural jobs underline the fact that seasonal agricultural labor is a line of work that the most disadvantaged populations are forced to do. And since it is Syrians who currently occupy the bottom of the social hierarchy, they are the ones who do these jobs. This analysis, while factually correct, is missing the crucial point that the main reason Syrian refugees could integrate into the migrant labor force so quickly is the family labor system organized around the institution of the labor intermediary. Although there are hundreds of thousands of refugees from countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, Somalia, and Turkey, who are also in the temporary protection status, they are rarely employed in these seasonal agricultural jobs, since most of them are bachelor men rather than families. Syrians displaced from their homes were already migrating as families, and in these jobs, the labor power of each member of the family was valued as one wage, whether they were children or elderly. Additionally, the labor intermediary system evolved as Syrian workers were integrated into the system. Since Syrian workers had to work more with large-scale labor intermediaries, but also needed someone to translate the instructions of the communication with the employer or the labor controller on site, large-scale labor intermediaries would work with smaller intermediaries, and each intermediary would charge an additional 10% of the Syrian workers' wages. I observed and heard about up to 3 labor intermediaries charging the same group of Syrian workers a 10% cut of their wages, while in the case of workers from Kurdistan, it was only 1 labor intermediary that charged the 10%. As an alternative to a motley of labor intermediaries, large-scale intermediaries could pair Syrian workers with a Kurdish or an Arab family from Turkey, depending on the common language, and they paid that family for the labor control of the Syrians. This practice placed Syrian workers in a relationship of dependence, hierarchy, and domination with other workers. In one case, I observed the Syrian head of the family being obliged to marry off his sister to the labor intermediary against his and his sister's will, out of fear of spoiling their relationship with the intermediary and losing all the money they had earned up to that point. In other words, racialization and securitization created not a simple binary relationship of the oppressor and the oppressed, or the dominant versus the subordinate, but multiple differentially racialized structures of domination and exploitation, the variety of which expanded immensely as Syrians joined this labor force. The transformation of the labor intermediary system, as well as the integration of the Syrian refugees into this system, also shows how a securitized system tailored to accommodate another racialized group of migrant workers from Kurdistan yielded itself to the integration of another such group, Syrian refugees. In conclusion, the family and its corollary labor control mechanisms, the labor intermediary, provides the connection of this labor practice to political violence. The role of the Kurdish family here is being a hub of social-political relations in surviving that violence while continuing to lead meaningful lives as political subjects. Therefore, it is not only poverty or social control that places the Kurdish family at the foundation of the social world built on kinship, place-based relations, but also war, occupation, and racialized labor relations. Many worker families factor in where other members of their extended family will go to work for the season and which labor intermediary their relatives work for while making their own decisions for the season. Those who have gone without their extended family have expressed feeling less safe and lonelier. As Narin once said, if something dangerous happens, it is your paternal uncles who protect you. And dangerous things happen if you are a Kurdish migrant farm worker in Western Turkey. Those who have gone without their, sometimes students who manage not only to finish high school while working, but also get into the university, do these jobs in order to be close to their families in the summer, although they could earn more money if they worked in big cities or in tourism. The labor intermediary is part of that social world in which kinship networks empower people and allow them to continue living their lives as political subjects, especially in the face of racism in a land hostile to them. However, as with every social relation, kinship, and place-based ties are also fraught with power, domination, and hierarchy. It is these gendered and racialized power relationships upon which both the institution of the labor intermediary and the practice of family wage labor are built. Thank you for listening. And I am open to questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. DuRuiz. And I really appreciate the way that your research helps us think through the family unit as a racialized economic category directly related to work and labor in this context, and not simply in terms of dichotomies between public and private spheres and so on. I'm hoping we get some good questions here. Just a reminder to everyone, please type your questions into the Q&A box. I recognize this means a bit of a lag as people are typing, but our first question actually is about your podcast. Andre asks, he says, thank you very much, Professor DuRuiz, for the fantastic and important moving presentation and research. My question has to do with the Cayman podcast. What were and what are your intentions with the podcast? Why record a podcast? What have you been learning from the experience? Are you receiving good feedback from it? To what extent can a podcast be a good tool for scholars and I think implicitly public intellectuals toward a better, more democratic and less formal kind of communication about your research? I mean, I think if I can add to this, one of the really neat things about your research is that it is involved with real people and people's struggles, and it's not just one of these high academic pieces of work designed to advance your career. So how does the communication aspect of the podcast help you with being a public intellectual?
It's a really interesting and really right-on question for what I presented here, because I am invested in producing public knowledge, and the institute that I was placed in before coming to Carleton, Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. Now it was studies when I entered. I prefer studies. What is really global affairs? It hosted many workshops, and it is also the home many workshops in which scholars develop their work, and that was one form of public knowledge production. And it's also the home of Cayman Modern Turkish Studies, which is a program specifically focusing on mostly modern Turkey, but also some late Ottoman Empire historical research. And the aim of the podcast was to create public knowledge, or like have conversations with scholars working on topics related to modern Turkey, and turn them into one form of public knowledge, or knowledge consumable by the public in less academic, more publicly accessible language, with more examples and in a more conversational format. And I really like doing that. So right now, Anush Suni is at Cayman Institute, and she is the postdoctoral fellow there. We are planning to do a joint podcast. So if you're interested in modern Turkey, and especially nationalism in modern Turkey, we will come up with a new episode soon.
The second question says, thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question regarding your use of the term subsumption to describe the effect of capital on the labor unit of the family. Could you elaborate further on how you're using the Marxist concept of subsumption and why it is important for describing this case?
Yeah, I think that's something I'm mulling over, and I didn't really want to test it out in this domain, but can we have a conversation about it? I think a lot of people are well versed in Marxism here. I mean, so that I can get feedback. My main inspiration comes from the aspect of subjectivity, and it's as it emerges in one of the courses that I'm teaching at the Institute, and how Marx talks about formal and real subsumption as two different modes of the transformation of the labor force. And when I talk about these moments of both the demographic transition from Turkish to Kurdish migrant laborers, and the mechanisms of labor control and discipline that it brings about, I think the family as a labor unit, we can consider as a mode of real subsumption, or as a mechanism that intensifies the exploitation of workers. And in a secondary moment that I describe as the transformation of the labor force with the integration of Syrian workers, that subsumption gets even deeper, or more exploitation mechanisms are added. So not necessarily distinguishing between formal and real subsumption as two moments in which capitalism becomes one thing or another, but using that concept as in order to explore the mechanisms that through which domination and exploitation create the subject of the worker within the context of the family. Because for Marx, as he looks at the industrial capitalism, or the emergence of the industrial capitalism, the individual worker or the individual free worker is the main labor unit, right? But we know that capitalism took advantage of many other forms of labor, not only the individual laborer. Many sharecropper families, for example, were employed as families in Brazil. What I find closest empirically to this case is the colonato system, in which the plantation owners employed families from the beginning instead, and preferred employing families for wage labor. And there are non-wage forms of employing families in agriculture and in non-agricultural sectors as well. So Jair Spinaggi talks about it as the different forms of labor as types of selling one's labor power, right? Like, so if we call this subsumption, or a method of, let's say, exploitation, the family would be, or family labor would be, a method of the sale of the individual's labor power. Whereas instead of going into, like, is this peasant capitalism, or is this petty commodity production or whatnot? So that's my vague thinking, which I think, and I'm very open to anything that can inspire me to theorize it further.
Thank you. And I think this is probably something we really could talk about it at great length. We do have a number of other questions, though, so maybe we'll come back to subsumption at the end if there's time. Kevin asks, I fear this may seem reductive, but when or where employment relations are eager to treat the family as a productive unit, is it useful for us too to consider the family as an entity having finite, if unquantifiable, capacity? For instance, there are bound to be broadly borne costs to tacitly calling upon the family to produce so many things, including, as you hinted, the production of hope in trying times, along with various forms of affective and practical support for family members' well-being and maintaining the family bonds themselves, aside from economic production. So the crux of this question is, do we need to consider the family as not having unlimited capacity to do what it's called upon to do?
I'm making notes. This is a great question, Kevin. And that's one that I'm struggling with, I must admit. But I think there's also a merit to that production of hope, which can be then turned against capitalism. So I am not proposing here, definitely, family as a social unit that which we should strengthen at all. That's what governments and right-wing politics does, right? But my insistence of the focus on the family, which exceeds our understandings of, or exceeds also the capacity of capitalism to subsume it, right? And its valuation as a form of both political and social belonging, can we reappropriate it? That's what I'm questioning. So, of course, there are many pitfalls there. And I am thinking of, like, I am also worried about reproducing or trying to start a dead kinship debate in anthropology. So there are many, I have a lot of questions about it. But the political reason that I cited at the beginning, I mean, the methodological one is that, like, family was always in my field work, loud and clear. And people were, it was a double-edged sword, right? People were both trying to escape from families and constantly returning to families to produce life. Or trying to come up with, like, you know, get married, stay with their family for a while. And then it's not like the nuclear family, it's more extended family through a patrilineal unit. But there is something in a racialized population that makes family there, that, or at least there, that gives me hope in their talking about the family, because the talking about the family then means, as in the case of slavery, for example, working for your community, working for your family means taking away from the time of capital or of your master, right? And there's a similar dynamic going on there. And especially for racialized populations, the family is one way of also resisting the racial domination that comes with that particular economic exploitation model. So instead of, say, you know, like citing our moral objections to the unit of family, what can we do from within the concept of family that workers use to empower themselves is my starting point. but I am aware of the very many dangers and risks that I'm taking here.
Thank you. We have several more questions coming up. I'm going to start collating some of these together. So 2 questions related to the PKK, actually. Next, and the first is from Noah. It says, hello, Deniz, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on the extent to which Kurdish migrants are associated with the PKK and Marxist-Leninist ideology outside of Kurdistan, and whether their racial or ethnic character as a people therefore has political connotations. And if so, do you think that future persecution of Kurds as a whole could occur if a fascist and/or extreme anti-communist government emerged in Turkey, such that ethnic cleansing and/or genocide could be undertaken under the guise of anti-communism, for example, as it appeared to be in the case of the mass killings of communists in Indonesia in the 1960s? The second one comes from Jacob Wilson. Thank you very much, Professor. Do you feel that the more recent political works of Öcalan have had any concrete influence or impact on the status of women and an attempt at non-patriarchal or hierarchical socialization? And Jacob actually noted they had two questions, only one of which has been posted so far. So Jacob, feel free to post your other question as well.
Let me respond to these first, because these are like many historical avenues that I am not sure if I will be able to keep in mind altogether. So the PKK started out as a Marxist-Leninist organization, but is no longer considers itself as a Marxist-Leninist organization. And Jacob, with the latest or later writings of Öcalan, they shifted their attention to the project of political autonomy rather than a Marxist-Leninist national liberation paradigm. So I would say the existence of Kurdish women guerrillas, more than any ideological writings, empowers women in Kurdistan, all women in Kurdistan, and all women in Turkey, really, I would say. Although a lot of people would contest that. But in Kurdistan, there is a very organic relationship, especially of the poor, especially of the rural, well, also urban poor, with the PKK. They're their children, literally. So among the farm workers that I worked with, there were, I would say, like at least half of the families had 1 or 2 guerrillas in their extended family. And some families also had their children in the mountains, right? But of course, the expected or the life expectancy of a guerrilla is about 5 years after they become a combatant. So there were many funerals to go to. But yes, that, I mean, the Turkish state is, the crackdown on the Turkish, both legal political movement, which is represented by a political party in the parliament, and the armed resistance was crushed with a fascist attack in 2015 and 2016. The Kurdish movement is still trying to recover from that, but it's very difficult. A lot of people who are democratic supporters of this movement are exiled. And yeah, it's the fascist mass destruction of people and like multiple massacres happened since the foundation of the Turkish Republic, which is 1923. And the PKK actually emerged in reaction to those massacres. So it's not like an impending danger, it keeps happening. And that's why I'm saying war and political violence, because it's an ongoing issue, both in Kurdistan and in Western Turkey. And there is a correlation between war and battles, actual armed struggle, the escalation of armed struggle, and dying down of it, and racist attacks on Kurds when they are working as farm workers. One chapter of my book is completely about that, about the racial aspect of it. That's why I didn't talk much about it. This part, I'm trying to figure out how to deal with the family issue and gender as much as I can. But they're racially marked as inferior. Kurds are discriminated against, they're stigmatized, and they're always under the danger of being seen as potential terrorists and being jailed or being put in prison with no evidence whatsoever. So that's Turkish state. Fascism is there already. But yeah, the PKK is strengthening the position of women, both because of the women guerrillas and because the Kurdish political movement has that awareness and intervenes. When I say Kurdish political movement, there are multiple factions and wings in it, but they're all they allege their loyalty to Öcalan. But there are different parts of it. Some of them are not really on board with the armed struggle, for example, but they're active in their social communities. And actually, when the Turkish state cracked down politically on all Kurdish political movement, the women's shelters and the women, I'd say militants or urban militants who intervene in cases of domestic violence, for example, were taken under custody or arrested, or some of them had to escape. So that was a clear blow to any attempt at gender equality. So there's that effect as well. Am I missing any part of the question?
We should move on to another pair of questions, generally about the family itself and the gender division of labor. One says, thank you very much, Professor DuRuiz, for this fascinating presentation. Could you please elaborate upon the gender division of labor within these racialized labor regimes and talk a bit about gendered forms of exploitation within the family labor? And the second question that I'll pair with this says, thank you, Deniz. This is from Stacy Douglas. I wanted to go back to what I wonder is a tension at the start of your talk. I believe you said that most of the world's familial structures do not resemble the white heteropatriarchal nuclear family that has been the target of so much worthy criticism in the last 50 years or so. And yet you continue to describe that familial unit as hegemonic. So she's wondering how you're using the concept of hegemonic here. Is the normative family a fantasy pursued by policymakers?
I'll start from there. I do think that it is hegemonic in the sense that it creates the desire and establishes the norm to be multiple different family forms should strive for. And I talked about the colonial elites, for example, and their formulations of the ideal nuclear family. Although they are also emphasizing, they were at least the initial anti-colonial nation state formations, and they're the founding elites of the nation states, post-colonial nation states, were stressing their difference from the West, while also saying, well, the same thing, we have the families, it's just we're going to make them smaller. So I think I use hegemony in the sense that it is the ideas of the ruling class on the one hand, and it generates a desire on the other. But of course, I also talked about the internal others, right? So the Kurdish family structure really does not fit the nuclear family. There's always, a couple with a young couple mostly who has kids, and then older parents of the young man. So that's mostly an extended patrilineal family unit. And even if it's not, mother, father, children, or one family, nuclear-ish family unit within an extended family unit, there has to be women in a family unit, in the labor sense. So if there are no women, or the women are too old to do the reproductive labor necessary to match, it's like not the regular reproductive labor either. I mean, reproductive, I'm not even like going into that. Let's say care labor. In order to make full workers out of children or elderly that I will have to define as people over 55, let's say, because these are bodies who have been working in agriculture under the sun for 50 years. They age very quickly. I think I aged quite a bit myself while I was working in the fields, but it was like 2 years almost. So the women's work there is essential in averaging everyone's labor into a full worker that can be waged as one wage, like with one wage. So it's a super exploitation of women's labor for sure. And that's also, women work in the fields and then do the reproductive chores of the family, preparing everyone for the next working day, and generally go to bed around midnight, wake up at 5, go to the fields, all of that. So it depends really on the number of women in whatever we call a family unit, but it's always gendered to the disadvantage of women and girls.
Thank you. I'm looking at the clock and I recognize we're at 10:30. We did start about 10 minutes late, but I don't want to take it too far over time. What I'd like to do is just convey the couple of comments that are in the Q&A box as well, and give you the last two questions together. They're not necessarily similar questions, but I'll just read them out, and Deniz, you can answer them as you see fit. The first comment comes from the earlier conversation about the nature of the family. It says, I would say we need to judge the family based on its content rather than purely its form. Second comment says, thank you very much, Professor. I enjoyed listening to you. I'm Kurdish from Syria. I've been to Turkey as well. Kurdish people in Turkey are encountering many challenges, and identifying themselves as Kurdish would put their lives in danger. The two questions. So thank you very much for those comments. The first question from one of the attendees. Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. My question has to do again with subsumption. And I'm wondering what it means for our understanding of the family if real subsumption implies the at least partial subsumption of the reproduction of labor under capital. I guess I'm saying it seems the family in this case is both subsumed under capital and a limit to its expansion. The second question is the second one from Jacob, noting that you're certainly grappling with the tension here with notions of familialism. To me, it seems clear there is a concrete basis of meaning and resistance here. If we are meaning to change the world rather than merely interpret it, as the well-worn phrase goes, we have to subject this site to serious analysis, as you are doing. My question thus concerns the social reproduction of subjectivity. Do you see the family unit itself as a site of individual proletarianization, or the site of the formation of a collective worker identity? Is the head of the family, in quotes, who receives pay, thought of by the family unit as the wage earner, as in the nuclear model, or is there something else going on in the internal way that the family members and co-workers think about and theorize and imagine the scenario that they're in?
These are excellent questions. Is there a way that I can get these questions like in writing after the webinar?
I've copied a few of them. I can copy them into a
copied
document.
them, but I want all of them. These are excellent questions.
I'll put them all in a document for you.
I copied as much as I could while also trying to answer them, but I'm sure I missed a few. These are excellent questions, and thank you again for everyone. This question of subsumption, or the family, the subsumption of family under capital, as well as being a limit to its exploitation, is the exact phrase that I have been looking for. It's very validating to hear that it resonates. And now I can continue writing about it. Thank you very much. Social reproduction of the laborer within the family is another facet. I mean, the social reproduction of subjectivity of the laborer is another excellent avenue to go through. And yeah, that's what I have been trying to do. The individual and collective subjectivities of the workers do not overlap with what we see or what we think of as the normative middle class white nuclear family member. And therefore the head of the family, or whoever happens to be the head of the family, because sometimes it's women, right? There are many women-headed families, is not thought of as the main provider, because the workers are the family members, they're children, right? When I asked these workers, so could you not go, right? How do you make your decision to go or not go? Could you spare yourself this year, for example? Or could you, there are terrible work accidents. And I was talking to a worker who had lost her father because he fell off the tractor and the tractor fell on the side and killed him there. And she was, of course, I mean, devastated about this. And her brother committed suicide after this because he couldn't, he was the first one who saw the scene. What made her even, I mean, the way she told the story was, we came back home with the clothes that we were wearing to work. Like we came with nothing. We lost our father. I came with muddy shoes directly from the field because the owner of the field called the military police so that they would pressure us into not pressing charges. So, and I asked her, could you have not gone? And she said, how else would my father feed 8 mouths? Right? So the father is not resented, for example, for making the children work as it is in the middle class normative imaginary. It is a collective survival effort. It is a world built on this collective survival effort, survival from exploitation as well as ethno-racial and political domination. So that's what I'm trying to underline in the collective aspect of it. And of course, within that family structure, there are like multiple lines of exploitation and gendered exploitation, domination, and sexism. But yeah, and that's why I'm hesitating about subsumption, because there's that something more, right? But I think the content of the family rather than the family form is a good place to start rethinking about this. And I'm like, I want to congratulate myself on taking the risk to present this half-baked idea, because you guys helped me think through it so much. You should always invite your keynote speakers to present their half-baked ideas to you. It's really productive collective thinking process.
It was a very productive talk, I think, for many of us. So thank you very much. Let's have a virtual round of applause as best we can do in this format for Dr. DuRuiz. Thank you very much as well to everyone who asked a question or posted a comment. And I believe we have a 20-minute break now before the next panel resumes at 11. And Zoe, I believe there's everyone has a different link to connect to. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's different from this one, but it's the same link as yesterday that was sent out. There's only one Zoom link, and that link worked, and we know it works. So whatever link has been emailed out, or is on the website. Okay.
Thank you very much, and thank you again, Deniz. And
thank you all. This was excellent. Looking forward to the rest of the panels today.
As am I. So see everybody in 20 minutes.